Okay, I think we are recording. All right, looks like we're still recording. All right, let's pick it up. Part 2 here from the current slide. So, dislocations that occur at the the pips and the MCPs, um, and pips and dips. But you can see a beautiful example here of a dislocated number 1 MCP. And here the bones are completely no longer aligned. So this would present, you can see the outline of the hand, with visible, obvious deformity. And anytime you see visible and obvious deformity, that person must be referred to a physician to have it reduced. So, and we know that means put back in place. Sometimes when there is a dislocation or even a subluxation, there's also a chance that there's a fracture involved. So they should probably get an x-ray to make sure that the bones will go back together correctly and to make sure that there's no little blood vessels or nerves that get entrapped as it's getting reduced. So here's a beautiful image of a good dislocated at first MCP. You'll also see this image on a human in the training room on the wall, and I'm not naming any names, but this is one of the pictures that's up there, and the individual is given a thumbs up. So next time you stop by the training room, you can peek in and take a look. All right, here's a dislocated of a proximal or a PIP looking at this, we can see here, this is our good PIP joint, there's our dip joint, and this is a true dislocation. Those bones are no longer aligned. That the capsule is torn, likely, and the volar plate that sits over here is also likely torn. Again, the little tiny tendons and nerves and blood vessels that live together, the vans that run together, run through here. We want to make sure that that tissue has not been entrapped when it gets reduced. So if it spontaneously reduces, like say with a little bit of traction and the pain resolves, then that's great. If it does not, and even afterwards, the person should probably see a physician to have it x-rayed if there's any chance that they believe that there is a fracture. All right. Muscle and tendon injuries happen with overuse. So most commonly we'll see the itises, tendinitis, tenosynovitis, which is like that tendon sheath. We'll get there in a second. But those things happen with repetitive use. So like texting or playing video games or typing with that a lot of movement through the hands, through your paws, that can cause those small muscles that sit and support the wrist and the hand to become inflamed. And we saw yesterday how small those canals can be that allow the tendons to run through. So the person will present with pain, with swelling, with weakness, and inability to move. They'll be uncomfortable performing those activities. So, someone that has texter's thumb, which is a real thing nowadays, they'll be so sore for them to text. They'll want to find another way to text, like using their pointer finger, which is their number 2 digit, to just kind of single type rather than using their thumbs like for video games. Okay, so what do? We tape it. We want to make sure that muscle and tendon injuries have full range of motion and strength before they return. So number 1, the tendinitis. Inflammation of the tendons, and it can happen in all different places in the wrist because there's a lot of different tendons that occur. But what's causing the activity, like what's causing the pain, is what needs to be avoided. So if it's typing or if it's shooting a basketball, then those are the things that we need to reel in a little bit because that overuse of that activity is what's causing the inflammation. So we strengthen, we want to stretch, we need to protect, rest, ice, compression, and elevation. And one of the specific tendinitis is called de Quervain syndrome. And this is actually something that happens to people that do a lot of lifting, like a new mom might get de Quervain's tendinitis because they're constantly radially deviating in order to lift up their child, like to pull their child towards them. If you were to think about a baby being in front of you and lifting them up under their armpits, you can see how if you pull them towards you, how that's a radial deviation that's occurring if your thumbs are up, which clearly they would be in order to lift a human. So these two tendons in here that are on the radial aspect of the wrist, they start to swell up right through this tunnel here. And every time that the thumb is abducted by the abductor pollicis longus and the extensor pollicis brevis, these two muscles, these two tendons that exist, every time that it is extended or abducted, it causes a lot of pain through the wrist and into the thumb. And what does the person have to do? They have to decrease that activity. So they either have to stop lifting with that technique or they have to be braced so that that tendon can kind of get a break. And again, you use protect, rest, ice compression, and elevation, just like always. You need to decrease the activity that brings on the pain. Mallet finger. This is pretty common. You may have even seen this before in someone that you know, but a sudden force, something like a ball, a basketball, another person running at you, pushes your finger, which is fully in extension, into flexion at the dip. So here the dip actually gets pushed down, and in doing so, you can see here's a great image of it, that extensor tendon gets ruptured. So here's your dip. It was straight in a position of extension, and it got forced downward, and in doing so, it pops the extensor tendon. So the person will not be able to, because that tendon's torn completely, if it's true mallet finger, they will not be able to extend their finger again. Like once it flops down, it'll stay flopped down. They won't be able to pull it back up on their own. This actually is a bad injury, and it needs to be fixed surgically with a pin. They actually have to go in, and they have to surgically reconnect this extensor tendon. It's a big surgery. It's kind of important because you can't lose your ability to flex and extend at the dips. It's kind of important. All right, so what do? You splint it until you get to refer that person. So that's mallet finger, and that's the extensor tendon. Now the other way, if your finger is, here's more mallet finger. So sorry, the tendon can heal back to the bone, but it has to have surgery if it's fully torn. Here's the other one. Jersey finger. It's very similar to mallet finger. The actual fingers, the hands, it can be in a jersey, it can be in a helmet, in a face mask. So you can see an image here. This person was holding on to someone else's jersey, and in doing so, their hand, their fingers, their dips were in a position of flexion. They were bent down like a claw, and the person may be pulling away, or somehow it got stuck in the holes of a jersey, and in that, it actually pops the flexor tendon. So I used to remember it in jersey, we flex. That's how I remember the difference between the flexor tendon and the extensor tendon of mallet finger. So the flexor tendon is what's torn in jersey finger. So it's the same thing. And then again, you need to have, it's down here that gets torn. You have to have it surgically fixed. If the person can't fully extend or flex their dip, then they have to see a doctor right away because they have to have it pinned back down. That's a pretty significant injury. Boutonniere's deformment happens at the proximal interphalangeal joint at the PIP. An impact causes it to pop in, and the extensor tendon it falls to the side. It kind of it not so much dislocates as it pulls away because it's no longer held in place by the tendon sheath, by the tissue, the capsule that's supposed to hold it. So it kind of happens. It's kind of a mess in there is what's going on. That metabolically the tissue is actually torn. So that's a problem. Again, you may need to see a surgeon in order to have it fixed. It looks worse than it is, but the person may never heal. It might just be a deformity that exists in them because the tendon sheath may not ever go back to where it belongs. There'll be pain, there'll be swelling, and there will be visible deformity. All right, so here's some really cool images for some bone fractures coming up. The first
Did you just say all that?
Oh, hey, Mr. Hoff. Hey, we're recording a lesson for class. Hi. Hey, everyone say hi, Mr. Hoff. Let's clap it up for Mr.
Class.
Hoff.
I love you guys.
Oh, and he is the mayor.
Stay gold. Stay gold.
Hey, go Titans. All right, back to bone injuries. Bye, Mr. Hoff.
Bye, everybody. The answer is always C.
Only for number 7. All right, back to the lesson. So a fracture can occur with direct impact or falling an outstretched arm, any of those good things that happen to break bones. And we'll see some good ones in a second. But the one that's always a problem that we get concerned about is the scaphoid or the navicular, and that is the one that has most commonly non-union and can lead to avascular necrosis, which is tissue death due to lack of blood supply. And we see that in the scaphoid/navicular, same bone, scaphoid. Also, the word navicular should be there too. Anytime that there is pain at the base of the snuff box, we have to splint right away and get that person to an experienced radiologist or an experienced orthopedic surgeon who knows how to look for it. Because sometimes you can actually have a fracture of the scaphoid or of the navicular, but it goes undiagnosed, and then the person has terrible wrist pain for an awful long time because it doesn't heal because there's no blood supply. So that's always a problem that we have to look out for. All right, so let's look at some breaks. Some metacarpal fractures. Here, these beautiful. Someone don't step on my hand; that hurts. So someone stepped on this person's paw, and look at these beautiful spiral oblique fractures here. Crazy, crazy stuff. This person's hand is beat up. All right, some phalange fractures. Phalanx, these phalanxes, these bones are broken. All right, beautiful images of fractures that occur here, okay, and all the little pieces. Here's a non-union fracture of the scaphoid of the navicular. You can see here is you can't really, I mean, it's hard to tell here, but this is the end of the radius. Here's a good look at the hook of the ulna, okay, and right through here, there is a non-union fracture that's occurring. Okay, so there's a non-union fracture that's occurring right in there. All right, looking at a boxer fracture, remember this is when you don't punch straight. This is when you punch a little bit with a hooking motion. So we don't want to have a boxer fracture. Here, this is a bad, no bueno. When this is the rotated view of this really shows a beautiful fracture. Here you can't see it quite as well, but you really see it right there. Don't punch walls and don't punch bowling apparatus. So you know who you are. All right, a Colles fracture, falling an outstretched arm. Here is what it looks like for the deformity that occurs for that type of fracture. And a Colles fracture and a Smith fracture, they happen at the epiphysis. So there's this growing area of the wrist, and the bone breaks in there. So those are Colles and Smith fractures. All right, that's it for part 2. Some beautiful fractures and some nice injuries, some tendonitis, some mallet finger, some Bonnier's deformity, Jersey finger, de Quervain syndrome, all those exciting things that we just spoke about. So now you're going to complete your crossword and your worksheet. And then lastly, with no word bank, you will recreate the hand with all of the bones and the joints independently as a fun grade. Okay, so you're going to do great. And pay close attention. And it is due today. It must be turned in with your crossword and your worksheet today. Do not take them home. Fill them in and complete it. Your crossword, your worksheet, and your fun, which is your hand drawing from scratch with no word bank today. Okay, talk to you later.